It's over. They know everything. We have to disappear tonight.
Oh, God, no. But where can we go?
Most people blamed ghosts for things that went bump in the night, but ghosts didn't leave behind a trace of expensive Italian oud wood and the unmistakable tang of fresh copper. For 3 nights, Betty assumed the massive, radiator-like heat radiating against her back at 3 a.m. was just a vivid product of her exhaustion-induced dreams. But when she woke up clutching a handful of silver-white satin smeared with dried crimson, the math suddenly stopped adding up. The city's most elusive shipping tycoon wasn't vacationing in Sicily. He was bleeding out on the right side of her mattress. To the high society elite of Cincinnati, Ohio, Betty was effectively part of the architecture. At 28, her gorgeous, full-figured black frame was treated like a human vacuum cleaner, expected to erase every speck of dust from the grand estate while remaining completely silent. She wore her constricting, ill-fitting Maid uniform like a suit of armor, ignoring the petty slights from her hyper-competitive co-workers. Betty wasn't here to play social games. She was fiercely determined to save every dollar by her independence and build a secure life where no one could look down on her. But her quiet sanctuary shattered entirely the moment a catastrophic water main break drowned the basement quarters, exiling her straight into the lion's den, the forbidden master suite of Tiziano Angelo. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Betty knew exactly how to make herself small in a room that demanded she be invisible. At 28, her full-figured black frame was a striking contrast to the cold, angular opulence of the Angelo estate, but she had mastered the art of moving like a shadow. While the other maids spent their mornings adjusting their hair in the mirrors, hoping to catch the eye of a wealthy associate, Betty kept her eyes fixed on the floor. She swept, dusted, and polished, her mind entirely focused on the numbers ticking upward in her savings account. Every dollar was a step closer to her own apartment, her own life, and a future where she wouldn't have to swallow the subtle, venomous comments about her size from women who starved themselves for a glance from the elite. Her uniform was a constant, physical reminder of her status, stiff, ill-fitting, and pinching at her waist as she hauled heavy cleaning carts up the sweeping marble staircases. Yet, she wore it without complaint. She was here for a paycheck, not a fairy tale. The mansion itself felt like a gilded cage, a monument to a man everyone whispered about, but no one actually saw. Tiziano Angelo was a myth wrapped in a tailored suit. To the newspapers, he was the brilliant, olive-skinned shipping tycoon driving Cincinnati's economy forward. To the staff whispering in the dark corners of the kitchen, he was a lethal predator, a mafia boss whose nod could make a man disappear overnight. Betty didn't care about the danger or the rumors. As long as the checks cleared, Tiziano's underworld dealings were none of her business. She kept her head down, worked until her muscles ached, and retired to the cramped basement quarters each night to dream of her eventual escape. She thought she had a handle on the rhythm of the house, a predictable routine of grueling labor and quiet isolation. But the universe had other plans, and the structural foundation of the mansion was about to give way, dragging Betty out of the shadows and throwing her directly into the path of the city's most dangerous man. The rain had been drumming a relentless, violent rhythm against the foundation of the estate for hours before the disaster finally struck. It was just past midnight when a deafening crack echoed through the basement staff quarters, followed immediately by the rushing, icy torrent of a ruptured water main. Within minutes, the carpets were submerged, and chaos erupted as displaced maids and kitchen staff scrambled up the stairs, clutching whatever dry belongings they could salvage. Mrs. Gable, the hawkish estate manager, stood at the top of the stairwell, her face a mask of rigid frustration as she checked off names and assigned the remaining staff to the spare second-floor guest rooms. When she reached the bottom of her list, her sharp eyes locked onto Betty, who stood quietly at the back of the crowd, holding a small duffel bag and shivering in her emerald green satin pajamas. There were no more guest beds left. Mrs. Gable rubbed her temples, letting out a sharp, calculated sigh as she looked toward the restricted corridor of the mansion. She told Betty to take her things to the East Wing master suite, reminding her that Mr. Angelo was away in Sicily and that she was to sleep strictly on the far left edge of the bed, leave his personal belongings untouched, and be out first thing in the morning once the plumbing crew arrived. The master suite was a breathtaking, cavernous expanse that felt less like a bedroom and more like a temple to unyielding power. It smelled richly of mahogany, expensive leather, and that faint, intoxicating trace of Italian oud wood. Dominating the center of the room was a custom king-size bed draped in heavy, silver-white satin sheets that shimmered under the dim moonlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Exhausted from a grueling 14-hour shift and the midnight evacuation, Betty couldn't afford to be intimidated by the sheer scale of the room. She carefully climbed onto the very edge of the mattress, the luxurious silk swallowing her weary frame as she plunged the room into absolute darkness. Outside, the storm howled against the reinforced glass, making her feel incredibly isolated. She closed her eyes and let the heavy, paralyzing weight of exhaustion take over, entirely unaware that the locked room wasn't as empty as it seemed. Sometime in the quiet hours before dawn, the storm outside settled into a low, rhythmic hum, but the silence inside the master's suite grew suffocatingly heavy. Betty was suspended in that thick, paralyzing fog between deep sleep and waking consciousness when the mattress suddenly groaned under a massive, unyielding weight. Her breath hitched. She froze, her wide eyes staring blindly into the pitch-black void of the room as a wave of intense, radiator-like heat radiated against her back. She tried to tell herself it was just the house settling, an echo of the storm, but houses didn't breathe. A ragged, feverish exhale brushed the nape of her neck, sending a violent shiver straight down her spine. Then came the scent, sharp, distinct, and terrifyingly close. It was the rich aroma of Tom Ford cologne mixed with the metallic tang of fresh copper and raw, masculine sweat. Before a scream could clear her throat, a heavy, muscular arm draped possessively over her full waist, pulling her green satin pajamas flush against a solid, iron-like chest. Terrified to her core, Betty squeezed her eyes shut and lay perfectly still, anchoring her fingers into the bedding. The figure didn't move to hurt her. Instead, the man let out a long, shuddering sigh, burying his face into the dark curls of her messy bun. His skin was burning hot, radiating a frantic, erratic pulse that vibrated against her spine. She stayed awake for hours, trapped between paralyzing fear and a strange, confusing warmth, until the first gray light of morning finally bled through the blackout curtains. When she snapped her eyes open at 6 a.m., the weight was gone. She scrambled out of the bed, her heart hammering against her ribs as she checked the heavy oak doors. They were still dead-bolted from the inside. The massive bathroom and walk-in closet were entirely empty. Yet, when she turned back to the bed, the evidence was undeniable. The silver-white satin sheets on the right side were violently tangled, and right there, smeared against the pristine fabric, was a dark, crimson stain. Fresh blood. Whispering to herself that she was losing her mind, Betty frantically stripped the bedding, scrubbing the fabric in the sink until her knuckles were raw, knowing she had just shared a bed with a ghost who bled. By the fourth night, the paralyzing terror had morphed into an all-consuming, desperate curiosity. Betty skipped the evening meal in the staff kitchen entirely, smuggling a thermos of strong black coffee up to the master suite. She was determined not to let sleep claim her tonight. At 1 a.m., the mansion was dead silent, the only sound the faint hum of the central heating. She sat propped up against the pillows, her fingers tightly gripping the silver-white satin duvet, her wide eyes locked onto the heavy oak bedroom door she had personally dead-bolted. At exactly 2:15 a.m., a soft, mechanical click resonated through the quiet room. Betty's breath caught in her throat. The sound didn't come from the hallway. Instead, a massive floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelf along the far wall groaned, sliding forward and pivoting outward to reveal a narrow, pitch-black architectural passage hidden deep within the mansion's walls. A man stumbled out of the darkness and into the dim light of the bedroom. He was tall, well over 6 feet 3 inches, with broad, powerful shoulders that seemed to fill the room. His ruined black dress shirt hung completely unbuttoned, heavily stained with dark, crusting blood over his left ribs. His face was a battered landscape of sharp angles, light beard stubble, and ruthless features, his slicked-back black hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. Betty clapped both hands over her mouth to stifle a scream. She recognized him instantly from the framed corporate profiles in the library downstairs. It was Tiziano Angelo. He had never gone to Sicily. He had been shot, betrayed, and was hiding like a cornered animal in the secret veins of his own home. Tiziano didn't even glance toward the bed, glazed with fever and blinding pain. He dragged his leg heavily toward the en-suite bathroom. A moment later, a sharp, muffled groan of agony cut through the silence. Betty sat frozen, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was just a maid, an invisible woman paid to scrub floors, and this was a lethal mafia boss. Every survival instinct told her to close her eyes and pretend to be asleep. But as Tiziano stumbled back into the bedroom, his knees catastrophically buckled. He collapsed onto the floor beside the mattress with a heavy, hollow thud, gasping for air as he clutched his bleeding side. The low, agonizing sound that escaped Tiziano's lips shattered the illusion of the invincible mob boss. He lay trembling on his knees, his dark, fever-bright eyes suddenly snapping upward to lock onto Betty's face. In a fraction of a second, the lethal predator reemerged. His right hand shot toward the waistband of his slacks, drawing a sleek, heavy handgun. His hand shook violently from the fever, but the muzzle pointed directly at her chest. He rasped a gravelly warning, demanding to know who sent her and threatening to end her life if she screamed. Betty threw her hands up, her green satin pajamas catching the dim light as she breathlessly explained she was just the maid, relocated because the basement quarters had flooded. Tiziano processed the words, his adrenaline evaporating as his eyes rolled back, and the weapon clattered against the hardwood floor just before his massive body slumped into unconsciousness. Betty sat frozen, her chest heaving. Every survival instinct screamed at her to unlock the door, run down the grand staircase, and leave the bleeding syndicate leader to his fate. But looking at him, she saw only a dying man. Throwing fear aside, she scrambled off the mattress and flew to the en-suite bathroom, grabbing every clean towel she could find. Navigating the dark mansion with surprising grace, she slipped down the back stairs to raid the emergency medical cabinet, stealing heavy-duty antiseptic, saline, medical tape, and advanced butterfly closures. For 2 grueling hours, Betty functioned as a makeshift trauma surgeon on the edge of the silver-white satin bedding. She cleaned the grotesque, infected puncture wound below his ribs, ignoring his unconscious groans of pain. She packed it tightly, pulling the torn flesh together with the closures, and wrapped his muscular torso in clean gauze. After mixing crushed antibiotics with water, she painstakingly massaged his throat to force him to swallow. By the time she finished, the morning sun was threatening the horizon. She hid the soiled towels deep in the walk-in closet, hauled his upper body onto a pile of plush pillows on the floor, and covered him with a thick wool blanket just minutes before the estate manager knocked sharply on the door, completely unaware of the bloody salvation that had just taken place inside. When Betty returned to the master suite that evening, the air in the cavernous room felt noticeably lighter, though the tension remained palpable. She carried a smuggled tray containing a bowl of rich, steaming chicken broth and a glass of electrolyte water. The moment she closed and locked the heavy oak door behind her, the metallic click of a firearm echoed through the quiet space. Tiziano was awake. He was still on the floor, propped up against the mahogany bed frame, but the glazed look of delirium was entirely gone. His dark, piercing eyes were remarkably clear, tracking her every movement with sharp intelligence. The fever had finally broken. Slowly, Tiziano lowered the weapon, though his large, calloused fingers didn't relinquish their grip. He studied her critically, his intense gaze taking in her full-figured frame, her expressive black eyes, and the dark circles of exhaustion etched beneath them. He remarked that she hadn't turned him in, his gravelly voice holding a trace of disbelief. Betty kept her posture steady despite the trembling in her hands, setting the tray down on the nightstand. She countered defiantly that calling an ambulance for a man bleeding out in his own secret walls hardly seemed like a smart move. A grim, breathless chuckle escaped Tiziano's lips, cutting short as he winced, his hand immediately pressing against his bandaged left side. He revealed that his rumored trip to Sicily had been a calculated diversion. His own underboss, Matteo, had orchestrated an ambush at a private airstrip, forcing him to crawl back into the mansion's architectural veins to survive. Looking down at the clean, meticulously wrapped gauze anchoring his torso, Tiziano's expression softened, an unfamiliar warmth entering his eyes. He asked for her name. When she quietly replied that people called her Betty, he tested the name on his tongue, declaring that she was either remarkably brave or incredibly foolish. For the first time, the imposing barrier between the ruthless syndicate boss and the invisible Maid dissolved completely, replaced by a silent, powerful understanding as he reached out and permitted her to help his massive, recovering frame up onto the silver-white satin bed. Over the next 3 days, the restricted master suite became a sanctuary of intense, hushed intimacy. By day, Betty moved like a ghost through the estate, enduring the subtle, venomous remarks of co-workers who mocked the space she took up in the world. By night, she returned to Tiziano, bringing fresh dressings, ice packs, and smuggled meals. As his immense physical strength returned, the dynamic between them shifted from shifting survival to a magnetic, overwhelming pull. Tiziano no longer looked at her like a civilian who had stumbled into his war. He watched her with a fierce, unwavering fascination. He watched the graceful sway of her full hips under that dreadful uniform, and the gentle, deliberate precision of her hands as she tended to his healing flesh. He was a man who had survived on cold paranoia, yet he found himself utterly captivated by the profound warmth she radiated. On the 4th night, after she finished securing his clean bandages, Betty went to pull her hands away, but Tiziano's large, calloused fingers gently caught her by the wrists. His grip wasn't a constraint, but an anchor. He looked up, his dark eyes boring into hers, and asked why she flinched whenever he drew close. Betty swallowed against the tightness in her throat, looking down at the silver-white satin. She confessed the brutal truth, that she knew how the world viewed a plus-size black woman in a maid's uniform, that she knew she was meant to be invisible, and that she was entirely unaccustomed to being looked at by a man like him. Tiziano's jaw tightened with a sudden, dangerous fury, not directed at her, but at the hollow world that had dared to make her feel small. He pulled her gently forward, forcing her to sit on the plush edge of the mattress, and reached up to cup her soft, round cheek. His voice was a low, protective rumble as he told her that the women downstairs were nothing but ghosts starving themselves for the attention of men who would replace them in a heartbeat. He told her she was real, magnificent, and breathtakingly brave. For the first time in her life, the armor of her hyper-independence cracked. Under his serious, protective gaze, Betty didn't feel like a shadow hiding in the corners of a billionaire's mansion. She felt profoundly seen, fiercely desired, and unconditionally protected. The fragile sanctuary they had built inside the master suite shattered violently the following morning. Betty was polishing the heavy mahogany banister overlooking the grand foyer when the roar of high-powered engines tore up the mansion's gravel driveway. Through the towering glass windows, she watched 3 black, armored SUVs screech to a halt. The heavy oak front doors were thrown open with brutal force, and Matteo strode in, his sharp features twisted into a mask of cold arrogance, flanked by 5 heavily armed syndicate hitmen. Mrs. Gable scurried out of her office, her face draining of color as the underboss barked a lie about Tiziano's plane failing to arrive in Sicily. He claimed he was taking control of the estate immediately to search for potential threats, pointing his men directly toward the restricted East Wing master suite. Betty's blood turned to absolute ice. Tiziano had regained his mind. but his body was not yet ready to survive a close-quarters firefight against 6 heavily armed men. If they went up those stairs, he would be slaughtered. Without a second thought, she dropped her polishing rag and threw her full-figured frame clumsily onto the polished marble at the base of the staircase, letting out a piercing, dramatic wail of agony that echoed off the high ceilings. Matteo sneered in pure disgust, ordering his men to clear the clumsy obstruction out of the way. But Betty anchored her weight firmly against the massive wooden newel post, thrashing her legs and shrieking that her ankle was broken and her bone was protruding. When 2 hitmen stepped forward to drag her away, she swung her limbs with chaotic, unpredictable force, wailing at the top of her lungs and warning them not to touch a woman in agonizing pain. Mrs. Gable hovered nearby, completely mortified, attempting to de-escalate the scene. The brilliant, high-stakes distraction worked perfectly. For 3 agonizing minutes, Betty turned herself into an unmovable, thrashing physical barrier, forcing the armed men to awkwardly navigate around her size. By the time an infuriated Matteo finally bypassed her and kicked down the master suite door, the silver-white satin bed was neatly made and the room was entirely spotless. Tiziano had already vanished back into the shadows of the secret wall passage, leaving his executioners standing in an empty room. Late that night, Betty pushed open the heavy oak door of the master suite, locking the deadbolt securely behind her. The room was dark, but the suffocating dread that had hung over the estate all day was entirely gone. A soft, familiar mechanical click echoed through the quiet space as the mahogany bookshelf slid forward. Tiziano stepped out from the architectural shadows, dressed in a sharp, pristine black suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His posture was unyielding, his jaw set, and his dark eyes burned with absolute clarity. The wounded animal was gone. The undisputed king of the syndicate had returned. He crossed the room with powerful, measured strides, closing the distance between them until Betty's back pressed flat against the solid oak door. He didn't speak a word. Instead, his large, calloused hand slid into her dark curls, tilting her head back as he brought his lips down to hers. The kiss was fiercely possessive, a deep, demanding surge of gratitude and raw passion that stole the breath completely from her lungs. Betty melted against his solid, unyielding chest, her fingers desperately gripping the lapels of his suit jacket as she finally let the day's terror wash away. Tiziano murmured against her lips, his breath hot and ragged as he told her he knew what she had done on the staircase, praising how she had shielded him yet again. Betty looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs, and whispered that Matteo would have killed him. A cold, lethal promise flashed in Tiziano's eyes as he stated that the underboss would be dead before sunrise. His loyal factions had already been mobilized, and the purge of the traitors had officially begun. Stepping back, he took her hand, his thumb gently smoothing over her knuckles as he told her to pack her things. A sudden flash of panic flared in Betty's chest, and she asked if he was sending her away, if her time in the mansion was over. Tiziano let out a rich, genuine laugh, lifting her hand to press a lingering kiss against her skin. He looked deep into her expressive black eyes, telling her that what was his, he kept. He declared she would never wear that humiliating uniform again, and that he was taking her to his penthouse to ensure she would never, ever be invisible again. Looking into his serious, protective gaze, Betty knew her old life was gone. She was no longer just a plus-size maid hiding in the corners. She had saved the king of the underworld, and in return, he was crowning her his queen. Share this video with your fellow romance drama addicts, and do not forget to subscribe for more jaw-dropping, real-life inspired tales. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. See you in the next dramatic story.